Cora Halloran dropped her 2 carpet bags on the dirt of the High Lonesome Ranch, and the dust rose in 2 sad puffs, coating the cracked leather of her boots. The motion was final, the sound a dull thud that seemed to echo the closing of a door somewhere far behind her. Beside her, her son, Leo, a boy of 6 with eyes as wide and silent as a deep well, clutched a fold of her worn gingham skirt. He did not look at the ramshackle house or the tired-looking barn. He looked only at his mother's face, his anchor in a world that had come loose from its moorings. Cora took a breath, the air thin and sharp with the scent of pine and dust, and the distant animal musk of cattle. Her lungs, accustomed to the thick, humid air of the lowlands she had lost, felt scoured. This was it, the end of the line, the last name on a list of maybes that had dwindled to a single, desperate hope. She looked at the main house, a 2-story clapboard structure that had been painted white so long ago, the color was now just a ghost clinging to the weathered wood. It looked tired, like a person who had been standing in the wind for a century. A woman emerged from the house, wiping her hands on an apron that had seen better decades. She was tall and raw-boned, with hair the color of pewter pulled back so tight it seemed to stretch the skin over her cheekbones. Her eyes were the gray of creek stones after a hard rain, and they held no welcome. They held inventory. They assessed Cora's worn dress, the patches on Leo's trousers, the exhaustion that clung to them both like the trail dust. This was Edna Garrett, the owner, the gatekeeper. "You're the one who sent the letter," Edna Garrett said. It was not a question. Her voice was like gravel rolling downhill. "I am," Cora replied. Her own voice was low but clear, with none of the waver she felt in her knees. She had practiced this. She would not beg. She had lost her husband, then her farm, then the last of her dignity boarding a train that left her stranded at a station 2 days' walk from here. She had nothing left to lose but her composure, and she would hold on to that with a death grip. "Cora Halloran, and this is my son, Leo." Edna's gaze flickered to the boy, who pressed himself tighter against Cora's leg. The woman's expression did not soften. "The letter said you were a widow. It didn't say anything about a boy." "He doesn't eat much," Cora said, her hand resting protectively on Leo's head. "And he's no trouble. He's quiet." "The world is full of quiet troubles," Edna stated, her eyes returning to Cora. "I need a cook and someone to manage the house. The last one I had was lazy, and the one before that was a thief. I've got 4 hands to feed and a ranch that's holding on by its fingernails. I don't have time for charity cases or extra mouths that don't work." Cora felt a familiar, cold knot tighten in her stomach. It was the same dismissal she had faced in every town since her world had collapsed. But this time she did not look away. She had walked for 2 days under a relentless sun for this chance. She would not be turned away at the door. She said the one thing a desperate woman was never supposed to say, not a plea for pity, but a statement of fact, as solid and unadorned as a fence post. "I am not a charity case, Mrs. Garrett. I ran a 200-acre farm for 5 years after my husband passed. I can cook, clean, mend, garden, and keep books. I know how to stretch a dollar until it screams, and I can tell by the way your lead steer is favoring his left foreleg that he's got the beginnings of foot rot. I'm not asking for a handout. I'm offering you the best damn help you're ever likely to find. And all I ask in return is a roof and 3 meals a day for me and my boy. You don't even have to pay me wages for the first month. If you're not satisfied by then, we'll be on our way." The silence that followed was heavy. The wind whistled through the eaves of the barn. A man, wiry and with a face like tanned leather, stopped what he was doing by the corral and watched them. Edna Garrett's stone-gray eyes narrowed, studying Cora as if she were a piece of livestock she was considering buying. The mention of the steer had landed. It was a detail only a person with real experience would notice. Just then, a cry came from the direction of the barn, a thin, distressed bleating. A young ranch hand, barely a man, came running out, his face pale with panic. "Edna, it's Bess's new calf. It's come, but it ain't breathing right. It's going blue." Edna swore under her breath, her attention snapping from Cora to the barn. "Damn it all, that's my best milk cow." She started to move, but Cora was already in motion. "Leo, you stay right here by the bags. Don't you move," she said, her voice dropping into a register of calm command. She strode toward the barn, her exhaustion forgotten. She didn't wait for an invitation. She walked past the stunned young hand and into the dim, hay-scented interior. Edna followed, her skepticism warring with a flicker of grudging curiosity. She found Cora kneeling in the straw beside a panting heifer. The calf was small, slick, and terrifyingly still, its tiny chest barely moving. Its tongue was indeed turning a dusky shade. Without a word, Cora gently but firmly took the calf's head in her hands. She cleared its nostrils with her finger, then tilted its head back. She took a small flask from a pocket inside her dress, something she always carried, filled with a mixture of molasses and water. She dipped her finger in it and rubbed it on the calf's tongue. It was a trick her father had taught her to stimulate the swallowing reflex. She worked with an economy of motion that was mesmerizing. Her hands were not delicate, but they were sure. She began to rub the calf's chest with a piece of rough burlap, her movements brisk and rhythmic. "Get me a bucket of cold water," she said over her shoulder to the young hand, Jed, who had been watching, frozen. He jumped as if startled from a dream and ran to the pump. Edna stood by the stall door, arms crossed, saying nothing. She watched this strange, dusty woman who had appeared at her doorstep, now working as if she owned the place. She saw no panic in Cora's face, only intense, methodical focus. When Jed returned with the water, Cora dipped the burlap in it and gave the calf a quick, shocking rub down. The calf gave a shuddering gasp, a tiny choked cough. Then another, stronger one. Its limbs twitched. Its tongue, slick with molasses, flicked out and licked weakly at the air. A moment later, it let out a thin, wavering bleat. The color was returning to its body. Cora sat back on her heels, letting out a slow breath. She looked at the calf, then at the exhausted mother cow, and gave the heifer a gentle pat. Only then did she look up at Edna Garrett. Her face was smudged with dirt, and her dress was now stained with straw and birth fluids, but her eyes were direct and unflinching. Edna looked at the revived calf. She looked at the boy, Jed, who was staring at Cora with open admiration. She looked at Cora, kneeling in the muck of the birthing stall, looking more at home than anyone had in this barn for a long, long time. The hard line of Edna's mouth did not soften, not exactly, but something in her posture shifted. The fight seemed to go out of her, replaced by a deep, familiar weariness. The bunkhouse is mostly empty. Silas and Jed sleep in the lean-to off the barn. "Abel has a room in the house," she said, her voice still gravelly, but without its earlier edge. "You and the boy can take the main room. It's got 2 beds and a stove that works most of the time." She paused, her gaze sweeping over the scene one last time. "You get 1 week. We'll see how you manage." It was not a welcome. It was not kindness. It was a provisional offer, a wager made against her better judgment. But for Cora Halloran, it was the first solid ground she had stood on in months. She got to her feet, brushing the straw from her skirt. "Thank you," she said simply. "You won't regret it." Edna Garrett just grunted and turned away, leaving Cora and the breathing calf in the quiet dark of the barn. Chozik. The bunkhouse was a simple affair, one long room smelling of old wood smoke, sweat, and dust. But it was solid. The roof looked sound, and the 2 iron-frame beds had mattresses stuffed with straw that, while lumpy, were dry. A pot-bellied stove stood cold in the corner. Cora set her bags down and looked around. It was not a home. It was a shelter. For now, that was more than enough. Leo stood in the doorway, a small, silent sentinel, until Cora went to him and gently led him inside. She unpacked their few belongings. 2 changes of clothes each, a worn copy of Robinson Crusoe, a small sewing kit, and a framed, faded photograph of a smiling man with kind eyes. She set the photograph on the small, unsteady table between the beds. It immediately made the space feel less empty. Her first true act was not to rest, but to claim the kitchen. Edna had pointed her toward it with a jerk of her chin before disappearing into a room she called her office, the door closing with a sound of finality. The kitchen was the heart of any ranch, and this one was having a seizure. Dirty dishes were piled in a basin of greasy water. The floor was gritty with tracked-in dirt. A half-empty sack of flour had been knocked over, leaving a white smear across the floorboards. The air was stale, smelling of old coffee and fried bacon. It was a room that spoke of meals eaten in haste and without pleasure, of a place run by people too tired or too resentful to care. Cora rolled up her sleeves. She found soap, lye, and clean rags in a pantry that was, thankfully, better stocked than the state of the kitchen suggested. She sent Leo out to sit on the porch steps, where she could see him from the window, and then she began to work. She did not work with frantic energy, but with a steady, methodical rhythm. First, the fire in the huge cast-iron stove. She cleared the old ash, laid fresh kindling, and soon had a low, efficient fire burning, heating a massive kettle of water. Then the dishes. She scrubbed them with a stiff brush until they squeaked, rinsing them in scalding water and setting them to dry on a clean cloth. She scoured the basin until the tin shone. She swept the floor, not just the middle but all the way into the corners, collecting a shocking amount of dirt and debris. She scrubbed the long wooden table where the hands ate, working the lye soap into the grain until the wood, stained and scarred as it was, began to look pale and clean again. As she worked, she took inventory of the pantry. Sacks of flour, cornmeal, beans, potatoes, onions, tins of tomatoes, jars of preserved peaches that looked untouched, smoked hams hanging from the rafters. The supplies were there, but they were neglected. It was a kitchen of potential, not of practice. By late afternoon, the transformation was nearly complete. The room was clean. The air smelled of soap and wood smoke. And something else was beginning to creep in, the scent of baking bread. Cora had found the yeast, mixed the dough, and kneaded it on the now spotless tabletop. Her movements were economical, practiced. She didn't pound the dough. She persuaded it, folding and turning with a strength that came from years of the same motion. While the loaves were rising near the warmth of the stove, she put a great pot of beans on to simmer with a chunk of salt pork and some onions. She found potatoes and peeled them, setting them to boil. The men came in from the fields as the sun began to dip below the high peaks to the west. They entered hesitantly, as if unsure they were in the right place. They stopped in the doorway, their faces grimy with sweat and dust, and simply stared. Jed, the young one, was the first to speak. "Smell good," he said, his voice full of wonder. The other man, the one Cora had seen by the corral earlier, was older with a sour, pinched face. This, she surmised, was Silas. He grunted, his eyes scanning the clean room with suspicion, as if looking for a trick. A third man followed them in, older still, with a calm, weathered face and slow, deliberate movements. He had kind eyes, the color of a faded blue sky. He didn't say anything, but he gave a slow, deliberate nod in Cora's direction. This must be Abel. Cora did not greet them with a flourish. She was at the stove, slicing thick pieces of the fresh, warm bread. "Wash up," she said, her back to them. "Supper's on." They washed at the pump outside, the sound of splashing water a familiar evening ritual. When they returned, the table was set. Not with fancy china, but the tin plates were gleaming. In the center of the table sat the steaming pot of beans, a bowl of boiled potatoes glistening with a dollop of precious butter she had found in the cool box, and a platter piled high with thick slices of bread. It was simple food, peasant food, but it was hot, plentiful, and offered with a sense of purpose. The men ate. For the first few minutes, the only sounds were the scraping of spoons against plates and the low crackle of the fire. Silas ate with a kind of grudging intensity, as if angry that the food was good. Jed ate with the joyful abandon of a young man who was perpetually hungry and rarely satisfied. Abel ate slowly, thoughtfully. Finally, Jed pushed his empty plate back. "Ma'am," he said, looking at Cora, who was eating her own small portion at the end of the table with Leo beside her. "That was the best meal I've had since I left home. Could I have another piece of that bread?" "There's plenty," Cora said, nodding toward the platter. Jed took a piece, his grimy face breaking into a genuine smile. It was a small thing, a piece of bread, a simple compliment. But in the charged atmosphere of the High Lonesome, it felt like a treaty being signed. It was the first brick laid in a foundation of trust. Silas watched the exchange. His eyes narrowed and said nothing. Abel, finishing his own meal, wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. He looked from Jed to Cora, and for the first time, his expression held something more than just placid observation. It was a flicker of approval, as fleeting and as real as a spark from the fire. When the meal was over, Jed started to gather the plates, a task he clearly was not used to. "I can help clear up," he offered. "I'll manage," Cora said. "But thank you, Jed." After the men had retreated to the barn and the quiet of the evening settled over the ranch, Edna Garrett emerged from her office. She stood in the doorway of the kitchen, her arms crossed. She took in the clean room, the tidy pantry, the lingering, wholesome smell of baked bread. Her gaze fell on the empty platters. "They ate it all," she observed. "They're hard-working men," Cora replied, her hands deep in a basin of hot, soapy water. Leo was asleep, his head resting on his arms at the table, the half-eaten crust of bread still in his hand. Edna didn't reply for a long moment. She walked over to the stove and poured herself a mug of the coffee Cora had made, strong and black. She took a sip. Her expression was unreadable. She looked at the sleeping boy, then at the woman working at the sink, her back straight, her movements unhurried. For the first time, Edna Garrett allowed herself to feel a sliver of something that was not suspicion. It was not hope, not yet. It was closer to curiosity. This woman, this Cora Halloran, was not what she had expected. She was not beaten, not broken. She was a force, quiet and unassuming, but a force nonetheless. Edna took another sip of coffee. The coffee was good, it was hot, and for the first time in a long time, she hadn't had to make it herself. The days that followed settled into a rhythm dictated by the sun and the needs of the ranch. Cora rose before dawn, her first task to stoke the fire in the kitchen stove. The smell of coffee and frying bacon soon filled the house, a summons to the day's labor. She packed lunches for the men, thick sandwiches of leftover meat, hard-boiled eggs, and wedges of cornbread. She kept Leo close, giving him small tasks he could manage, sorting beans, fetching kindling, wiping the table. He remained silent, his world contained in the small orbit around his mother, but the tight, fearful pinch around his eyes began to ease. He would sit on the porch for hours, watching the vast, indifferent landscape, the worn copy of Robinson Crusoe open on his lap, though he could not yet read the words. Cora's competence was a quiet, constant thing. It was in the way she mended a tear in Jed's shirt with stitches so small and even they were nearly invisible. It was in the garden she started in a neglected patch of earth behind the house, turning the soil and planting the few seeds she had carried with her alongside some she found in the pantry. It was in the way she noticed the pump handle was working loose and had Jed help her tighten it before it broke entirely. She wasted nothing. Potato peels went to the single pig in its sty. Leftover scraps were simmered into stock. She moved through her days with a purpose that began to subtly alter the atmosphere of the entire ranch. The place had been running on a kind of stubborn, weary momentum. Cora was winding it back up. Jed was her first and most open ally. He was young and good-natured, and he appreciated a full belly and a kind word. He started calling her ma'am, and then tentatively, Mrs. Halloran. He would bring her wildflowers he found out on the range, leaving them in a jar on the kitchen windowsill. He spoke to Leo, not expecting a response, telling the boy about the horses and a hawk he'd seen circling overhead. Abel, the old hand, remained her quiet observer. He spoke little, but his actions were a language of their own. He began leaving a neatly stacked pile of firewood by the kitchen door every evening, saving Cora the trip to the woodpile. One afternoon, he found Leo on the porch, staring at his book. Abel sat down on the steps beside him, pulled out a small, worn whittling knife, and began to carve a piece of scrap wood. He didn't speak to the boy, but he sat with him, and by the time he was done, he had carved a small, perfect horse, which he simply placed on the book in Leo's lap before getting up and walking away. Leo picked up the horse, his small fingers tracing its form. It was the first toy he'd had since they'd left their home. Silas, however, was a bastion of resistance. He saw Cora's presence not as a help, but as a disruption, an indictment of the way things had been. Her efficiency made his own ingrained habits look like sloth. Her quiet authority chafed him. He was a man who thrived on predictable misery, and Cora was replacing it with an unfamiliar order. He began a campaign of petty sabotage and complaint. He would track mud across her clean floor moments after she had washed it. He would grumble at the dinner table that the stew needed more salt or that the biscuits were too brown. Back when Martha was cook, we had fried steak on Tuesdays, he'd say, loud enough for everyone to hear. Not just more beans. Cora never rose to the bait. She would meet his complaints with a level gaze and a quiet response. The beef is being saved for Sunday, Silas, and there's salt on the table if you need it. The confrontation, when it came, happened at the end of her first week. Supper was a rabbit stew she had made from 2 rabbits Jed had snared. It was rich and savory, thickened with flour and full of carrots from the last of the winter stores. The men were eating, the familiar silence of tired workers filling the room. Silas took one bite, then slammed his spoon down on the table. The clatter was loud and jarring. "I ain't eating this," he declared, pushing his bowl away. "Yard rabbit. A man works all day with cattle. He deserves to eat beef. This is woman's food." Jed and Abel stopped eating. Leo, sitting beside Cora, flinched at the loud noise. Cora did not stop working the piece of dough she was kneading for the next day's bread. Her hands, dusted with flour, continued their rhythmic push and fold. She did not look at Silas. She looked at his bowl of stew. "There is nothing wrong with that stew, Silas," she said, her voice even. "It's hot and it's nourishing." "It's not what I want," he shot back, his face reddening. "And I don't like the way you've come in here, changing everything. This ain't your ranch." Cora finally stopped kneading. She wiped her hands on her apron, leaving 2 white handprints on the dark fabric. She turned to face him fully. In her right hand, she still held a small, dense ball of dough. It was not a weapon, but she held it with a certain weight. "You're right," she said, her voice dangerously quiet. "It is not my ranch. It is Mrs. Garrett's ranch, and she has put me in charge of this kitchen. The food I cook feeds the men who work for her. If you do not want to eat it, you are free to go hungry, but you will not disrespect my work or this table." The air in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. Silas's face was a thundercloud of fury and humiliation. He seemed to swell in his chair, about to push himself to his feet. "Is there a problem here?" The voice came from the doorway to the office. Edna Garrett stood there, her arms crossed, her gray eyes missing nothing. She had clearly heard the entire exchange. She looked from Silas's furious face to Cora's calm, resolute one. "She's serving us rabbit, Edna," Silas sputtered, looking to her for support. "And telling me I'll go hungry if I don't eat it." Edna's gaze was cold. "Cora is the cook. What she puts on the table is what you eat. If you have a problem with that, Silas, your pay is waiting for you. You can collect it on your way out." She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. "Now, are you going to finish your stew, or are you leaving?" It was a public and undeniable sighting. Silas deflated. The bluster went out of him, leaving behind a sullen, beaten man. He stared at Edna, then at Cora, then back at his bowl. Without another word, he pulled the bowl back towards him and picked up his spoon. He began to eat, his head bowed, the fight gone out of him. The crisis had passed. Jed let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. Abel calmly resumed eating his own stew. Edna Garrett gave Cora a single, sharp nod, a gesture of confirmation, of authority delegated and now reinforced. Then she retreated back into her office, closing the door behind her. Cora turned back to her work, her hands once again finding their rhythm in the dough. She had been tested, and she had held her ground. More importantly, the gatekeeper had not just watched. She had unlocked the gate a little wider, letting Cora step more fully inside. The bunkhouse might be her shelter, but in that moment, the kitchen began to feel like her territory. Clear's throat. The incident with Silas marked a subtle but significant shift. Cora's authority in her domain was no longer provisional, it was established. Edna Garrett began to speak to her more, not with warmth, but with a kind of grudging directness. She would appear in the kitchen in the mornings to discuss the day's work, a new ritual that replaced her former isolation. She would ask Cora's opinion on the stores, on how long the flour might last, on whether the chickens were laying well. They were conversations of logistics, not of friendship, but they were a form of communion. One evening after the men had left and Cora was cleaning up, Edna came into the kitchen and sat down at the long table. She had a ledger book in her hands, and her face was etched with a familiar, weary frustration. "I can't make the numbers work," she said, more to herself than to Cora. "It's the same every year. Costs go up, cattle prices stay the same. It's like trying to fill a bucket with a hole in it." Cora finished wiping the counter and came to the table, drying her hands on her apron. "May I see?" she asked quietly. Edna hesitated for a fraction of a second, then pushed the ledger across the table. It was a gesture of trust that felt monumental. Cora sat down opposite her and opened the book. The pages were a mess of cramped, spidery handwriting, of crossed-out figures and ink blots. It was the accounting of a person overwhelmed. Cora, however, had a mind for numbers and order. For years, she had managed her own farm's books with meticulous care. She began to ask quiet questions. "This charge here, for freight from town, is that from Marcus Thorne's supply post?" "It all is," Edna said with a sigh. "He's owned the freight line and the supply store in Harmony Creek for 20 years. He's the only game in town, especially in winter when the North Pass is snowed in." Cora ran her finger down a column of figures. The numbers felt wrong, inflated. "When I was running my place, a 100-pound sack of feed cost me half this, and that was with a longer haul. Thorne says his costs are higher. Mountain roads, he says. He's been saying it for years." Edna shrugged, a gesture of helpless acceptance. "He's a pillar of the community, church deacon, the whole thing." "Pillars can cast long shadows," Cora said softly. She looked at the chaotic ledger, then at the stacks of unsorted receipts and bills piled in a dusty corner of the room. "Mrs. Garrett, Edna, your books are disorganized. It's hard to see the truth of things when they're in a tangle." Edna let out a short, harsh laugh. "That's the kindest word anyone's ever used for it. My husband, he handled all this. Since he's been gone, I've just been trying to keep my head above water." It was the first time she had mentioned her husband, the first crack in her armor of self-sufficiency. "I can fix this," Cora said. It was not a boast. It was a statement of fact, like saying she could bake bread. "If you'll let me, I can put your office in order. I can sort these receipts, balance these books. Then you'll know exactly where the hole in the bucket is." Edna looked at Cora, at the quiet confidence in her face. She thought of the clean kitchen, the mended clothes, the revived calf. She thought of how Cora had faced down Silas. Here was a woman who created order out of chaos. It was her nature. "The office is a rat's nest," Edna warned. "I've dealt with rats before," Cora replied, and for the first time the territory right next to a smile appeared on her face. And so Cora's work expanded. In the afternoons, after the midday meal was cleaned up and preparations for supper were underway, she would retreat into the dusty, paper-choked office. It was a room that had been neglected for a decade. Piles of invoices, deeds, letters, and old newspapers covered every surface. The air was thick with the smell of decaying paper and mice. But to Cora, it was a puzzle waiting to be solved. She started in one corner, as she had in the kitchen. She sorted papers into piles, receipts, correspondence, legal documents, trash. She was methodical, patient. She found a tin box containing Edna's marriage certificate and her husband's death certificate, which she set aside carefully. She found letters from Edna's sister in the East, filled with pleas for her to sell the ranch and come live in civilization. It was in a heavy, locked metal chest under the desk that she found the history of the ranch. The key was on Edna's ring, and she gave it to Cora with a simple, "See what you can make of it." Inside were the original land grants and deeds, going back to the founding of the Garrett homestead nearly 60 years prior. There were also ledgers, far older and neater than Edna's, kept by her husband and his father before him. Cora spent her evenings at the kitchen table, long after Leo was asleep, with the old ledgers and the new receipts spread out before her. The oil lamp cast a warm, golden glow on the papers as she compared the prices. And there it was, clear as day. The year after Edna's husband had died, the freight charges from Marcus Thorne's company had doubled. The price for feed, for salt licks, for barbed wire, for everything had crept up year after year at a rate far exceeding any normal inflation. It was a slow, systematic bleeding. Thorne had been preying on a grieving widow, counting on her distraction and her lack of experience with the books. The anger Cora felt was a cold, clean fire. It was the anger of a competent person witnessing the deliberate and predatory exploitation of another. But the anger was secondary to the search for a solution. Knowing the problem was only half the battle. The solution came from the oldest document of all. It was the original survey and deed for the entire valley. From a time when the Garrett Ranch and what was now the Thorn Ranch had been one single property, later divided between two brothers. Cora was not a lawyer, but she was a careful reader. She traced the lines on the old brittle map with her finger. She read the dense legalistic script, her lips moving silently. And then she found it. A single, powerful paragraph. It was a clause describing an easement of necessity. It granted the Garrett property, which was further from the main road, perpetual and unencumbered right-of-way across the frontage property, what was now Thorn's land, for the purpose of reaching the county road. Perpetual and unencumbered. That meant free. Thorn had not only been overcharging for his goods, he had been illegally charging for access to a road he had no right to control. He had been charging Edna Garrett for the use of what was, essentially, her own right-of-way. That night, Cora did not go to bed. She waited, the old deed and the ledger books laid out on the kitchen table, until Edna came out of her room, unable to sleep. "You're up late," Edna said, her voice rough with fatigue. "I found the hole in your bucket," Cora said, her voice low and intense. She walked Edna through it, step by step. She showed her the old ledgers, the sudden price hikes, the decade of slow theft. Edna's face, illuminated by the lamp, hardened into a mask of cold fury. But it was when Cora showed her the easement clause in the old deed, her finger pointing to the words perpetual and unencumbered, that Edna's expression changed from anger to stunned realization. All this time, Edna sank into a chair, staring at the paper as if it were a ghost. "My father-in-law used to talk about that right-of-way. I'd forgotten. After John died, Thorne just started sending bills for road use. I was so overwhelmed, I just paid them." "He counted on that," Cora said. "He counted on you being too busy and too grieved to look." Edna looked up from the deed, her gray eyes meeting Cora's. The weariness was still there, but now it was overlaid with something new, a steely resolve. The knowledge had not broken her. It had armed her. "That son of a bitch," she said, her voice shaking with a decade of suppressed rage. "He's not just a thief. He's been trying to bankrupt me so he can buy this place for pennies on the dollar." She stood up, her fist clenched. "Tomorrow, I'm going to town. I'm going to see Lawyer Hemphill, and I'm going to take this." She slapped the old deed. "And I'm going to shove it down Marcus Thorne's pious throat." A new level of trust had been forged over that table in the quiet lamplight. It was a trust born not of shared sentiment, but of shared battle. Cora had done more than balance the books. She had given Edna a weapon, and in doing so, she had shifted her own position from employee to something much closer to a partner. She had proven her value extended far beyond the kitchen. She was the mind the ranch had been missing. The next morning, Edna was a woman transformed. The weary slump was gone from her shoulders, replaced by a rigid posture of indignation. She hitched the wagon herself, her movements sharp and efficient. "I'm heading to Harmony Creek," she announced to the hands at breakfast. "I have business with Thorne and the lawyer. I might be gone a day, maybe two. Cora's in charge. What she says goes." She looked directly at Silas as she said it, leaving no room for argument. Silas just shoveled eggs into his mouth and stared at his plate. Cora walked with her to the wagon. "The weather looks uncertain," Cora noted, her eyes on a bank of dark, bruised-looking clouds gathering over the western peaks. "Be careful on the road." "I've driven that road and worse," Edna said, climbing onto the wagon seat. "This is too important to wait." She picked up the reins, the old deed and Cora's neat summaries tucked safely in a leather satchel beside her. She looked down at Cora, and for a moment her hard expression softened. "Thank you, Cora." Then with a flick of the reins, she was off, the wagon rattling down the long, rutted track that led toward Thorne's land and the town beyond. Cora stood and watched until the wagon was just a small speck, a knot of unease tightening in her stomach as she watched the clouds continue to build in the west. By midday, the sky had turned a sickly yellow gray. The wind began to pick up, whining through the cracks in the barn and rattling the windows of the house. It carried the sharp, metallic scent of snow. The cattle grew restless in their pens, lowing uneasily. Abel, his face etched with the wisdom of 60 winters in this high country, came to the kitchen door. "It's a bad one coming, Mrs. Halloran," he said, his voice grave. "A real blizzard. Edna won't make it back before it hits. She'll be lucky if she made it to town at all." Cora's unease solidified into cold certainty. The ranch was an island, and the sea was about to rise. Edna was gone, trapped on the other side of the storm. She was in charge. The thought was both terrifying and clarifying. "Jed! Silas!" Her voice cut through the rising wind. "We need to check the fences on the north pasture one last time and get the herd into the lower meadow. They'll have more shelter there. Abel, you and I will secure the barn and the house, and bring in extra water and firewood, all we can carry." The men, hearing the calm authority in her voice, moved without question. Even Silas, his face grim, seemed to recognize the gravity of the situation and the futility of arguing with a coming storm. They worked with a frantic, focused energy as the first flakes of snow, thick and wet, began to fall. The world started to shrink, the distant peaks disappearing behind a curtain of white. They got the last of the cattle moved just as the blizzard hit in earnest. It was not a gentle snowfall. It was a howling white fury. The wind screamed, and the snow flew horizontally, erasing the world beyond a few feet. Visibility dropped to zero. The temperature plummeted. The ranch was now completely cut off, a tiny outpost of warmth and light in a maelstrom of ice and wind. Inside the house, a tense quiet settled in. The storm raged outside, a constant, deafening roar. Cora kept the stove roaring, a pot of stew simmering on top, filling the house with a sense of defiant domesticity against the elemental chaos outside. Leo sat at the table, the carved wooden horse in his hand, his eyes fixed on the white oblivion pressing against the window panes. The crisis escalated just after dusk. Abel, who had gone out for one last check on the barn doors, stumbled on a patch of ice hidden beneath the fresh snow. He came staggering back into the house, his face pale and beaded with sweat, his hand clutching his chest. "Abel!" Cora cried, rushing to his side. He collapsed into a chair, gasping for breath. "My chest, a pain, like a hot poker." His face was turning a ghastly shade of gray. Cora's mind raced. It was his heart. She had seen it once before, with an elderly neighbor. She knew there was little she could do without a doctor, and a doctor was an impossibility, but she could not do nothing. "Jed, help me get him into my room. It's the warmest," she commanded. Silas stood frozen in the doorway, his face a mask of shock. "Silas, keep the fire stoked. Don't let it go down for a second." They half-carried, half-dragged the groaning man to the small room off the kitchen that Cora had been given. They laid him on the bed. His breathing was shallow and rapid. Cora felt for his pulse. It was thready and weak. She loosened his collar and covered him with every blanket she could find. She knew that warmth and rest were the only medicines she possessed. She sat by his side, wiping his brow with a cool cloth, her mind a whirlwind of fear and prayer. The life of this good, quiet man was in her hands. The night wore on, an eternity measured in the howling of the wind and Abel's ragged breaths. Sometime after midnight, through a lull in the storm, came a new sound, a heavy, insistent pounding on the main door. Jed looked at Cora, his eyes wide with alarm. Who in God's name would be out in this? "Stay with Abel," Cora said, her face set. She took a heavy iron poker from beside the stove and walked to the door, her heart hammering against her ribs. She drew the bolt and opened the door a crack. A figure stood on the porch, caked in snow, looking more like a monster of ice and fury than a man. He pushed the door open, stumbling inside and bringing a blast of Arctic air with him. It was a man Cora didn't recognize, burly and hard-faced. He was not from the ranch. "I'm looking for Edna Garrett," the man growled, shaking the snow from his coat. "I've got a delivery for her." "She's not here," Cora said, holding the poker tightly, "and nothing can be delivered in this storm. Who are you?" "Name's Cobb," the man said, his eyes sweeping the room with a smug arrogance. "I'm foreman for Marcus Thorne, and this ain't a delivery you can refuse." He reached inside his coat and pulled out a folded piece of paper, sealed with wax. He thrust it at her. Foreclosure notice. Thorne's calling in her debts. The ranch and everything on it belongs to him as of noon yesterday. You're all trespassing. The words hit Cora like a physical blow. Thorne hadn't waited. He had used the cover of the storm, knowing Edna was away, to make his final, brutal move. He was stealing the ranch. Jed and Silas had come out of the back room, drawn by the voices. They stood behind Cora, their faces a mixture of disbelief and fury. Silas, for the first time, looked at Cora not with resentment, but as a fellow defender of a home under siege. Cora's mind, however, was not on surrender. It was racing, connecting the pieces. The storm, Edna trapped, the medical emergency with Abel. And now this. It was a coordinated assault, a perfect storm of disaster designed to break them. But Thorne had made a critical miscalculation. He had assumed that with Edna gone, the ranch would be rudderless, its inhabitants a collection of hired hands who would scatter at the first sign of trouble. He had not accounted for Cora Halloran. She looked at Cobb, at his sneering face, and a cold, calm certainty settled over her. This was her moment. She was not just a cook or a bookkeeper. She was the acting head of this ranch, and she would defend it. "Get this man a cup of coffee, Jed," she said, her voice steady. The order was so unexpected, so contrary to the hostility of the moment, that both Jed and Cobb stared at her. "He's half frozen. No matter his business, we don't let a man freeze on our doorstep." It was a masterful move, an act of disarming civility that immediately shifted the balance of power. She was not the panicked victim. She was the gracious host in control of her home. Jed, catching her meaning, moved to the stove. Cora took the foreclosure notice from Cobb's hand. She did not open it immediately. She walked to the table and laid the poker down beside it. Then she gestured for Cobb to sit. He did so, hesitantly, his bravado momentarily punctured by her composure. She read the document. It was legal, binding, and brutal. It cited a list of outstanding debts, all stemming from Thorne's fraudulent charges, as justification for seizing the property. When she finished reading, she folded the paper neatly and placed it on the table. She looked at Cobb, her eyes clear and direct. "This document appears to be based on a significant accounting error," she said, her tone as level as if she were discussing the price of flour. Cobb scoffed. "There's no error. The debt is the debt. The judge signed off on it himself." "A judge can only rule on the evidence presented to him," Cora replied. "And it seems Mr. Thorne neglected to present all of the relevant documents." She turned and walked into the small, orderly office. The men watched her go, the only sound the howl of the wind and the nervous tapping of Cobb's fingers on the table. She returned a moment later, carrying a long, stiff piece of parchment, the original deed. She also brought one of the old ledgers. She laid the ancient deed on the table next to the foreclosure notice. The contrast was stark. One a document of theft, fresh and aggressive. The other a document of history, of right, of belonging. "This is the original deed to this valley, Mr. Cobb," she said, her finger tapping the brittle paper. "It contains a clause, an easement of necessity, granting this ranch perpetual and unencumbered right-of-way across the property now owned by Marcus Thorne. Unencumbered means free. For the last 10 years, your boss has been illegally charging this ranch for that access. That amounts to fraud." She opened the ledger. "Furthermore, I have audited these books. Mr. Thorne has systematically inflated his prices for this ranch, and this ranch alone, for a decade. The debt cited in your notice is not only invalid, it is fraudulent. In fact, by our calculations, it is Marcus Thorne who owes Edna Garrett a substantial sum of money." Cobb stared at the old deed, then at the ledger, then at Cora's unyielding face. He was a bully and a foreman, not a lawyer. He understood force and intimidation, not legal clauses and audits. He was out of his depth, and he knew it. He saw the looks on the faces of Jed and Silas, who now stood flanking Cora like a presidential guard. He saw that this was not the easy victory he had been promised. "You can take this notice back to your boss," Cora said, her voice dropping, each word landing like a hammer blow. "You can tell him that his fraud has been discovered. You can tell him that when this storm clears, Edna Garrett's lawyer will be in touch. And you can tell him that if he or any of his men set foot on this property again without an invitation, we will consider it trespassing and act accordingly." She pushed the foreclosure notice back across the table toward him. It was a complete and utter rout, achieved without a single threat of violence. It was a victory of intellect, of preparation, of pure, unadulterated competence. Cobb, his face a mottled red of fury and humiliation, snatched the paper from the table. He stood up, knocking his chair over. He glared at Cora, speechless for a moment. "You'll regret this," he finally snarled. "I doubt it," Cora said calmly. She picked up the poker again, not as a weapon, but as a simple tool to tend the fire. The gesture was clear. He was dismissed. His presence was no longer of any consequence. Cobb turned and stormed out of the house, slamming the door behind him. He vanished back into the white chaos from which he had emerged, defeated not by a gun, but by a woman, a piece of paper, and a well-kept set of books. In the sudden, ringing silence of the kitchen, Jed let out a whoop of triumph. "You did it, Mrs. Halloran! You did it!" Silas just stood there, shaking his head in disbelief, a slow, grudging smile spreading across his face. "Well, I'll be damned," he muttered. "I'll be damned." Cora felt a wave of exhaustion and relief so profound it almost buckled her knees. She leaned against the table for support. They were safe. For now. She had held the line. She looked toward the back room, where Abel lay sleeping, his breathing a little easier now. She looked at Leo, who had watched the entire exchange with wide, silent eyes. She had protected them. She had protected this place. In the heart of the blizzard, under siege from all sides, Cora Halloran had taken charge and proven that the High Lonesome Ranch was not just a place of work. It was a home worth fighting for. The storm broke on the morning of the third day. It departed as violently as it had arrived, the wind dropping to an eerie calm, the clouds tearing apart to reveal a sky of piercing, crystalline blue. The world outside was transformed, buried under a thick, pristine blanket of white. The silence was profound, broken only by the drip of melting snow from the eaves. Inside the house, the atmosphere was one of weary triumph. Abel's crisis had passed. His color was better, his breathing steady. He was weak, but he was alive. Cora had nursed him through the worst of it with a steady hand and a calm presence that had soothed not only her patient, but the frayed nerves of the entire household. It was late that afternoon when they saw the rider, a single figure on horseback, moving slowly through the deep drifts, following the line of the fence. It was Edna. She rode into the yard looking 10 years older than when she had left. Her face was haggard, her shoulders slumped with a bone-deep exhaustion. She had been stranded in Harmony Creek, frantic with worry, helpless as the storm raged. She had ridden out the moment the path was even remotely passable, fearing the worst. She expected to find her herd decimated, her men struggling, her ranch in ruins. Instead, she found order. The paths from the house to the barn and bunkhouse had been shoveled. Smoke curled from the chimney. As she dismounted, Jed came out to take her horse, a grin splitting his face. "Welcome back, Edna. We were worried sick." Edna looked at him, then at the peaceful scene, her face a mask of confusion. "The cattle? The storm? Cora had us move them to the lower meadow before it hit," Jed explained. "They're fine. A little hungry, but fine. And Abel, he had a bad turn, but Cora looked after him. He's resting inside." Edna walked toward the house as if in a dream. She stepped into the kitchen and stopped dead. The room was warm and bright. Cora was at the table, helping Leo trace letters on a piece of slate. The air smelled of coffee and vegetable soup. It was a scene of such profound, quiet domesticity that it took Edna's breath away. It was the image of a home she had almost forgotten she could have. Cora looked up. "Edna, you're back. We were so worried." Edna sank into a chair, the last of her strength seeming to leave her. I expected disaster." "We managed," Cora said simply. She got up and poured Edna a mug of hot coffee, placing it in her trembling hands. "But we had a visitor." Quietly, factually, Cora recounted the events of the blizzard, Abel's collapse, and the arrival of Cobb with the foreclosure notice. She told Edna about the confrontation, about the deed, about the stand she had taken. She downplayed her own role, presenting it as a simple matter of logistics and legal fact. Edna listened, her expression shifting from exhaustion to disbelief, and finally to a look of profound, staggering respect. She looked at Cora, this woman she had taken in on a desperate wager, and saw her for what she truly was. Not just a capable hand, but a leader, a partner, a savior. When Cora finished, Edna was silent for a long time, just staring into her coffee cup. "He came in the storm," Edna said, her voice a whisper of awe. "Thorne sent his man into a blizzard to throw us out, to leave you and the boy and my men to freeze." The sheer, malevolent cruelty of it seemed to land on her with its full weight. "And you faced him down with a piece of paper." She looked up, and for the first time, Cora saw the stone gray of Edna's eyes soften completely, glistening with unshed tears. "All these years," Edna said, her voice thick with emotion, "I've been fighting this battle alone. I was so tired of fighting. I was ready to lose. I thought I had already lost." She reached across the table, and her hand covered Cora's. It was a gesture of profound gratitude, of a bond forged in crisis and sealed in victory. "You didn't just save the ranch, Cora. You saved me." That night, after a quiet supper, where even Silas seemed subdued and respectful, the two women sat at the kitchen table again. The legal papers from Edna's trip to the lawyer lay between them, now joined by the old deed. The lawyer had confirmed everything Cora had discovered. They had Thorne trapped. His greed had made him sloppy, and Cora's diligence had exposed him. The fight was not over, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. The High Lonesome would survive. Edna pushed a different piece of paper across the table. It was not a legal document. It was a single sheet on which she had written a few lines in her spidery hand. "My offer was for a month's probation," Edna said, her voice steady and sure. "That month is not yet over, but I think we can agree that the terms have changed." Cora picked up the paper. It was not a contract for a cook or a housekeeper. It was a simple, handwritten offer of partnership. It offered her a full, equal share in the High Lonesome Ranch, its profits, its losses, its future. Cora read the words, and a warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the fire in the stove. She thought of her arrival, dusty and desperate, with nothing but her boy in her own two hands. She had come seeking shelter, a place to survive. She had not dared to dream of a place to belong. She looked at Edna, whose face held a look of quiet, hopeful anticipation. She looked at Leo, asleep in the corner, the little carved horse clutched in his fist. "The High Lonesome needed a cook," Edna said softly, as if reading her mind. "It needed a bookkeeper. It needed a manager who knew what she was doing." She paused, her gaze full of a meaning that went far beyond business. What it got was the woman who made it a home. Cora looked down at the paper, then back at Edna. She did not accept out of desperation, as she might have a month ago. She accepted as a choice, as an equal. She was no longer the outsider. She was the heart of the place. "Yes," Cora said, her voice clear and strong. "Yes." A slow smile spread across Edna Garrett's face, a true and genuine smile that seemed to erase the years of hardship. The two women sat in comfortable silence, the partnership agreement lying on the table between them, a testament to a future they would build together. Later, as Cora was tucking a blanket around the sleeping Leo, he stirred. His eyes fluttered open, and he looked around the warm, safe kitchen. He saw the firelight dancing on the walls. He saw his mother. He saw Edna sitting by the fire, her posture relaxed for the first time. His gaze lingered on her, then moved back to Cora. He reached out a small hand and touched her cheek. "Home," he whispered. It was the first word he had spoken in almost a year. It was quiet, barely a breath, but it filled the room with a power greater than any blizzard. Cora's eyes filled with tears as she hugged her son close. Music. The winter that followed was long and hard, but it was different. It was a season not of survival, but of consolidation and quiet joy. The legal battle with Marcus Thorne ended not with a dramatic courtroom showdown, but with his quiet, humiliating capitulation. Faced with irrefutable evidence of fraud and the threat of criminal charges, he agreed to forgive all outstanding debts and pay a substantial sum in damages for the illegal road fees. His reputation in the valley was shattered. The pillar had crumbled into dust. The money, carefully managed by Cora, was used to buy new breeding stock and repair the long-neglected barn. The High Lonesome began to heal. Cora and Edna fell into a partnership that was as natural as breathing. Edna brought her lifelong knowledge of the land and the cattle, her deep, intuitive understanding of the seasons and the sky. Cora brought her order, her financial acumen, and her unwavering methodical competence. They were two halves of a whole, their strengths complementing each other perfectly. Their conversations at the kitchen table were now about the future, which fields to leave fallow, whether to hire another hand come spring, the best price for their yearlings. Silas, won over by competence and a consistently full belly, became one of Cora's most steadfast supporters, his grumbling replaced by a gruff and protective loyalty. Jed adored her, and Abel, once he had recovered, would simply sit on the porch, whittling and watching Leo, who was slowly, carefully, beginning to talk again. The boy's words were like rare blossoms in the high country, precious and beautiful. One evening in early spring, as the last of the snows melted and the first green shoots began to appear in the meadow, Cora stood on the porch, looking out at the vast, peaceful landscape. The air was soft, carrying the scent of damp earth and new life. Edna came and stood beside her, a mug of coffee in each hand. She passed one to Cora. They stood in comfortable silence for a while, watching the sky turn from rose to violet behind the peaks. The ranch was quiet, the day's work done. Inside, the lamps were lit. Leo was at the table, drawing a picture of a horse for Abel. The house was filled with the smell of roasting chicken. It was a scene of simple, profound peace, a peace that Cora had earned not with a gun or with force, but with her hands, her mind, and her unbreakable spirit. She had arrived a desperate outsider, a widow with a silent son and 2 carpet bags. She had stood on this very spot and seen only an ending. Now she looked at the same house, the same barn, the same endless sky, and saw only a beginning. The High Lonesome Ranch had been a place of weary survival. Cora Halloran had made it a place of hope. She had not been given a home. She had built one.